Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Davitt Jones Bould and Vectos. My name is Toby Fox, and I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. As regular viewers are going to know by now, our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And we're doing that by offering this channel, the Voice of Authority, as a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions, their challenges, their influences, and issues of urgency. And we're going to be taking a break for a week next week to prepare for a big week of 3 events, starting with how the health service transformation is driving healthcare estates transformation with Morgan Sindel on December the 15th. And that's followed by discussion with Barking and Dagenham and Vectos of that borough as a case study of a suburb evolving in response to new life and work patterns. And then on the 17th, an examination of 4 case studies of rail-side development with the architect Pitman Tozer and TfL. And there'll be links to register for all those events being posted in the chat by my colleagues as we go through today's session. But we're here today because PwC estimates that by 2030, drones will have contributed to a £42 billion increase in UK GDP. And £16 billion in annual cost savings to the UK economy. And there are going to be 628,000 jobs in the UK drone economy. Now, we're used to hearing about how everything's going to be different in 5 years, in 10 years. And I grew up in the late 1970s and the 1980s when we were promised jetpacks, and I'm still waiting for mine. But between 2010 and 2018, the number of UK Civil Aviation Authority registered drone operators shot up from 5 to 4,411. And by then, there were over 650 UK firms providing urban air mobility, UAM, technology and services. So right now, drones are operating in this regulatory grey area. And it's grey because the regulations were designed for manned aircraft operating at altitude. But drones are already being tested in UK cities right now for flying medical supplies from one hospital to another, for surveying development sites, for supporting emergency services. So how long before they're replacing white vans and delivering commercially? Perhaps not long, because the climate emergency is forcing the issue and because there are big rewards at stake. Who's responsible for low altitude airspace, and what's the potential for licensing routes across it, or providing rooftop charging points, or repurposing car parks as local consolidation hubs for UAM deliveries? But where there are rewards, there are also risks. So who's going to decide that it's acceptable for unmanned aircraft to fly over the local primary school? Who determines that 60 flights an hour at night over my house is okay when there's a parallel route that would serve that flight equally well? And what are councils' liabilities in the event of a crash in their airspace? This webinar is going to set out the current legal position for councils. We're going to examine where different agencies' responsibilities lie. We're going to describe current UAM usage and trends internationally and nationally. And we're going to analyse infrastructure and sustainability implications and show how one UK local authority is making use of the technology right now. So to deal with all of that, it's a great pleasure to welcome to the Voice of Authority for the first time in alphabetical order, our panel, Andrew Charlton, Director General at the brand new Civic Air Transport Association, Paul Curtis, the Associate Director, Transport Consultant, Vectos, Yvonne Hills, the Client Director at the law firm Davitt Jones Bould, and Councillor Steve Pearce, Cabinet Member for Waste Commercialisation and Regulatory Affairs at Bristol City Council. Now, viewers, each of our panelists is going to make a short presentation, and that's going to be followed by a discussion with our panel, and we invite you to join that and welcome your questions from the very start today. So, Andrew, to pique our viewers' curiosity and stir them into action, what can you tell us about who's flying what and where, and what's driving the growth in UAM?
Thanks very much, Toby, and good morning, everybody. I hate it when the chairman puts such a great introduction into play, because I'm thinking, what else can I talk about now? What else can I talk? He's done such a great job of explaining the explosion in growth, but I think it's worthwhile taking a slight backward step, if I may say. Drones are not new. Drones, in fact, drones are so well established in the aviation industry that they are actually included in the Chicago Convention, which is the foundation document for aviation, signed in 1944. And indeed, for lovers of trivia, such as myself. The first ever commercially taken or professionally taken photograph of Marilyn Monroe is her holding a drone, because during the war she worked in a factory building drones, which were used for target practice for the Navy gunners. And so we have a regulatory framework for drones, which, as I say, dates back to 1944. And for the longest time, we had drones. We've had drones in a very real sense ever since, normally known as model aircraft clubs or known in the trade as modelists. You know, the guys, these blokes, they got a hat, they've got the big badge on it, they've got the jacket with the outside pockets, it's also got a couple of they got the aviator sunnies, you know, and they love to follow the rules. They set up rules, they fly within the rules, they have races, they have competitions, but they see themselves as very much a part of the aviation industry. And often they made these things at home. Their brothers probably put together PCs and that kind of thing. And these guys built those things and they were hobbyists. And then suddenly, about a decade ago, drones moved in from the hobbyist fraternity. They started to be made commercially, largely by a company called DJI based in China. And all of a sudden, drones went from being something operated by hobbyists to something operated by gamers. And that changed the game altogether, because whereas the modelists tended to go, oh, wow, how do I comply with the rules? How do I become a pilot? The gamers started to say, oh, cool, what else can I do? And so they started to push and push and push. And then since then, we've watched a bunch of other companies and industries realize that there's huge opportunities for drones, either for the heck of it, or more normally because it actually facilitates and helps their actual industry. And the obvious case in point there is Amazon. Amazon doesn't really care whether their product gets to you with a boy on a bike or a girl on a camel or by a drone. For them, the issue is delivery. And for them, the issue is that last mile. And they're trying to solve those problems. And Amazon, of course, got interested. Google got interested. What is the one common aspect between those two companies? Of course, it's infinite money. And so they started to look at what more they could do, which immediately threw up, exactly as Toby set out, some of the regulatory issues. Normally, what we do with aeroplanes is we assume that they're operating at 36,000 feet, or when they're not, they're operating at or near an airport, which is obviously a different place and a place with very strict rules about what you do. So all of a sudden, this uncontrolled airspace, which is up to about 500 foot, well, indeed it is up to 500 foot, about 150 metres, was where the drones were going to be operating, and it became a little bit of a free-for-all. Frankly, it remains a little bit of a free-for-all. I think that's slightly unfair because it's always been a free-for-all, and there's always been traffic in uncontrolled airspace. Helicopters, police helicopters, firefighters, news helicopters, hang gliders, all sorts of things. But what it's become with the advent of this sudden interest in the development of drones it's become more urgent that we resolve these issues. Following on from Amazon and Uber Amazon and Google and those sorts of companies desperately deciding that they'd like to get interested in this, as Toby said, there's been a huge surge in people that are looking at using drones. You can blame GoPro for a lot of this, of course. They had very stable cameras that would operate really well for a lot of surveillance, for surveying, for aerial photography, for things like that. And a lot of that is extremely positive stuff about how your house is built or what it looks like, or what is over the next ridge if you're firefighters, to know whether it's good to push this way or that way and those sorts of things. But again, there's been no rules and no controls. But the really interesting breakthrough has been in the last couple of years with the arrival of not just Airbus, not just Amazon and Google, but companies like Boeing and Airbus and Uber, and now the motor car industry as well. Hyundai, Toyota, General Motors, all of these companies are involved. And the breakthrough moment, as far as I'm concerned, is the arrival of Airbus and Boeing, because Airbus and Boeing know how to make aeroplanes. And making aeroplanes is part putting metal together and mostly doing the regulatory stuff that you've got to do to get aircraft certified, to get them approved, to get them into the air. Add to that the sort of expertise that you've seen with companies like Hyundai and General Motors and what have you. And we're moving from drones, which are small devices which deliver a book or a pair of shoes or something like that, to things that can actually deliver serious weights, 100 kilos, 200 kilos, which is really important from a logistical perspective, and also importantly, flying cars, what are called UAMs, urban aerial mobility, flying taxis, if you like. You know, those of us as old as me will remember the Jetsons, that kind of stuff. We're moving now to an entirely new array of services or potential services, but also a really interesting array of serious issues. These aircraft will be, and I call them aircraft, these aircraft will be powered not by big fuel, carbon fuel-driven turbo engines, but by electric engines or maybe hydrogen. A lot of the work that's going into the changing of aviation generally is actually finding in the UAM space its focal point, and of course that becomes circular. It's everything's driving everything else. But that also throws up questions of charging and recharging and what do we do with points, again, as Toby mentioned. I'm out of time, so I'll stop there, Toby, if you don't mind. But I think it's a really fascinating time in what is an increasingly fascinating industry.
That's terrific, Andrew. Thanks for giving us that really, really exciting intro. So the world of possibilities is opening up to us. Panel, indicate to me, give me a little wave if there's anything you'd like to pick up on, particularly in what Andrew was saying. And viewers, start getting those questions into us. We're really happy to field your questions throughout the session today. And Andrew, just before we go to the panel, what can you tell us about? I mean, you know, Amazon are here, and the aircraft industry is involved, and the motor industry is involved. Where exactly is there anywhere in the world where air taxis are actually flying, for example?
The answer is yes, half yes. There's certainly been the start of the sorts of things that tests and trials and those sorts of things. Singapore and Dubai have both started to look at whether or not this can be done. The one piece of good news in all this is that if air taxis involve humans flying around, so safety really is number one. Not that it isn't, of course, if you're flying books around, but once you start putting people on devices, you've made aeroplanes, and suddenly you've got all the safety criteria that come into play with that. But yes, there are already trials underway in places like Dubai, in Singapore, and there's plenty of others out there sort of on the runway, certainly the top of the runway, waiting to get clearance.
And the final bit from me, are Amazon actually dropping packages off for people using drones right now?
Again, trials have been made, things are happening. There's a bunch of issues, you know, do you overfly people? There's been trials done and services delivered in places like rural Australia where, you know, you'd need pinpoint accuracy to drop something on a person's head. And also some of those sorts of areas like that, as opposed to urban areas, because of the legal and the liability issues that arise. But the other really interesting thing that now that you've raised it, I'm going to steal another minute. And now another really interesting thing that is happening is we're coming at this from two ends. We're coming at it from the, if you like, the small drone end, the never had a person on board, but we're also coming at it from the big aeroplanes that used to have pilots on board that we're now getting rid of the pilots. And FedEx is already using Cessna 2.8s, which are small two-engine aeroplanes, to deliver up to 200 kilos in an unmanned aircraft. Now, that's really interesting from a logistical perspective because it brings not the last mile, but the second last mile into play, as they can take stuff from a major distribution centre to a node where they can distribute from there. But it also means that if, for example, your council has what in aviation terms is called an aerodrome, even a grass strip, all of a sudden they too can start to be infrastructure that can start to deliver these things and get trucks off the road, get white vans off the road, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and at a time when we're talking about vaccines, we've been talking about feeding people for the last 9 months and giving them medicines and so on. That all comes into play.
Again, I think, sorry, just the vaccine thing is going to be really remarkable because the vaccines need to be delivered at very low temperatures. By definition, a vaccine is live. It needs to go very quickly. If you can get, already we see a lot of vaccines and other medical supplies happening in Africa where the the ground infrastructure, the roads and what have you, are very poor, but the ability to deliver stuff in the air is really helpful. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see what our current requirement for emergency vaccine deliveries will do to kick all this forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Paul, you've been really patient. I've been hogging the stage because, like I said, I'm a big fan of jetpacks. I want one, and it's finally happening. So I get very excited about it. But Paul, you wanted to ask Andrew.
Yeah, no, enjoying the chat. Andrew, you're talking about Airbus and Boeing sort of coming into the market, which is opening the opportunity for larger freight consignments rather than just small little packages being flown. Do you have an idea? I mean, you mentioned Singapore and Dubai, but are those the sorts of places you think are kind of like the early adopter markets? And obviously it will be related to the regulations in the countries, but where might we see the larger consignments being sort of shipped around first?
There's a lot of issues to untangle there. I'm sorry. I mean, Toby, you said that you hog the floor, not as much as me.
The difference, Andrew, is that you've got information and insight.
Oh, now don't be like that. But you've got a great intro. So let me see if Paul, the really big, only Boeing has got clients that fly cargo freighters or freighters. And so Boeing is working, this is public information. FedEx, a decade ago now, perhaps not quite that long ago, purchased some massive number of 777s from Boeing. I think it was 80. The first two they got, they handed straight back to Boeing and said, make these operate unmanned. Because they worked out that if you take all the stuff that you need on an aeroplane to keep the humans on it, the heat, the water, the air, but also all that kit that the pilots look at, all that stuff at the front that they actually play with from time to time, not very often, it's not that hard a job. All that stuff there, if you take all that off, you've actually saved 10 tonne, which is a lot of lift. That's a lot of cargo. So we're looking at big aeroplanes, serious aeroplanes, unmanned aeroplanes operating in controlled airspace, but that's sort of on a different plane, if you'll pardon that pun, to the sort of the small things, the UAMs and what have you, partially because Boeing was into the big freighter stuff, Airbus, to leapfrog them, got into the other stuff. And then Boeing, of course, had to catch up. But what they bring is not necessarily just the big aircraft capacity or the big aircraft lift, if you like, but the certification expertise, the skills required. The certification departments of those airlines of those airframe manufacturers are remarkable. That, you know, I genuinely think they could get anything certified eventually. They know they just keep going at it and going at it. So but that will really speed up the process of bringing things like flying taxis and bigger lift devices into the market, because they just know so much about what needs to be done to get it done from a straight up and down, strictly avionics, aeronautical regulatory perspective. That's not to talk about the legal issues or liability or any of those other things, but just get the actual device certified. Then we're looking at where are the trials going to start to happen, and whether you're talking flying people, I think, is a different level of issue to flying goods. But then I think you're looking at countries and cities that want to be seen as pioneers, that want to be seen as forward-looking, that want to be seen as offering this sort of stuff. And in part, to come to some of the things I think Steve might be talking about, it's to keep cars off the road and to make things cleaner and greener and those sorts of things as well.
That's perfect, Andrew, because that segues us back, brings us back nicely from the kind of global and science fiction stage, if you like, back down to local authorities in the UK, which is our specific focus today. How is this technology and this change going to drive change for local authorities? Now, Yvonne, it's time to set the regulatory scene for us in the UK for councils. It's been described as a free-for-all by Andrew on a kind of global scale. Is that how you see the regulatory scene for local authorities in the UK?
Yes. So I think what I've found around a lot is it's an emerging area. And so what that means, in short, is that the legal position isn't entirely clear. I know that Andrew just said that drones have been around a long time, but I think for us in the UK, we're only just seeing the increase becoming more widespread, both for recreational use and obviously with commercial operations. So I think with this increase, it's critical that users are aware of their obligations, keep themselves other airspace users and the general public safe. So what is clear though is that there will be safety and privacy concerns, and for our purposes today, as you say, Toby, questions around governance. So the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, is responsible for governance of the airspace. It's the only organisation that can authorise changes to the structure. It's got an effective established process, as we said, which governs the higher level airspace and airspace around airports. But the position with lower level airspace, which, as we've said, is going to be that occupied by urban air mobility services, is not so clear. Currently, as long as pilots comply with the CAA regulations, unmanned aircraft can fly wherever they like. And so I think it's that that's given rise to questions such as you've posed. Can there be licensed red routes, and who determines whether multiple flights over someone's house is going to be acceptable? The CAA won't have the capacity nor the local knowledge to deal with the micromanagement of lower level airspace. And so that's led us to consider, should there be a framework in place for the CAA to delegate the governance? And should local authorities, which we say are best placed to engage with the public and address their concerns, have a role to play? So in short, we think local authorities do have a natural part to play, not only in promoting safe use of drones, but also in shaping of local and national policy and regulation of drone use and its users. So for local authorities, there's undoubtedly going to be opportunities, but against that, where there are opportunities, there's also risk. And so these potential risks are going to need to be understood and mitigated. So in order to get ahead of the curve, we think local authorities are going to need to have a clear understanding of the legislation and an enforceable policy in place. So turning first to legislation. It is complex, I'm afraid, and it continues to change. I'm not going to go into huge detail on the legislation, but I do just want to highlight a couple of key points. The principal legislation is the Civil Aviation Act 1982 and the Air Navigation Order 2016, as amended in 2018. I'll refer to that as the ANO. As I said, the CAA is the statutory authority responsible for regulation and is charged with enforcing the rules. So failure to comply with the NAO is a criminal offence, and we're seeing police being given greater enforcement powers. In the regulations, there's different key regulations depending on the mass of the drone and the intended use. So fundamental safety regulations, they're set out in Articles 94 and 95. They set limits on where unmanned aircraft may fly and whether they can be used for commercial operations. They don't encompass matters relating to privacy and security, but include, ensuring the aircraft flying safely, that's the remote pilot being responsible for ensuring safety, always keeping their drone within a visual line of sight, and not flying higher than 400 feet, 120 meters, to reduce the likelihood of conflict with manned aircraft, so airplanes that we were talking about. If the drone is fitted with some form of onboard camera, there are additional requirements, and that means that you can't fly over or within 500 feet, 150 meters of any congested area, or within 50 meters, 150 feet of people and or property that aren't under the direct control of the drone user. There were some changes introduced in November last year, and that's in the wake of the disruptions that I think we all heard about caused by misuse at Gatwick and Heathrow. And one of those changes is the mandatory drone registration scheme. So now anyone operating drones or model aircraft weighing between 250 grams and 20 kilograms must register with the CAA and take an online safety test. Failure to do so can result in a fine. In addition, talk about commercial drones, they've also got to get permission for commercial operation from the CAA, and that's going to act as evidence that the operators demonstrated sufficient levels of general pilot competence. There are changes, widespread changes planned with the introduction of new European regulations. They were expected to come into force July this year, but because of the pandemic have been delayed until 31st of December. Those new regulations are intended to remove limitations and ambiguity around commercial and non-commercial drone operations, and they will follow guidelines based on the weight of the drone being used, the type of operation being carried out, and the level of risk. So we're going to need to assess those changes quite closely. But in principle, in light of the change in legislation, local authorities are going to need to ensure that they have an appropriate policy in place. And there was a recent study conducted of over 350 local authorities that found that at present councils don't have appropriate policies in place. And for those that do, they're often inaccurate, out of date or inconsistent with the regulations. And that's going to put local authorities at risk of challenge. What we would say is that local authorities should look to have policies with a lead officer responsible for implementing and maintaining that policy. And that's got to include ensuring keeping up to date with the latest legislation, and then in local context, detailing relevant local airspace restrictions, recording restrictions and opportunities for recreational flying from council-owned property and land. Might also want to keep up to date a record of flight restriction zones within that area. As I say, there are a lot of unknowns and a lot to think about. One thing, I think I'm over, but one question you posed about licensing of red routes over council land. So the position basically is a landowner owns the airspace as is necessary for the reasonable use and enjoyment of the land and the buildings on it. So above this and up to 500 feet is Class G airspace, and as I say, under the governance of the CAA. But there are no restrictions in flying in that airspace other than those safety measures set out in the ANO. So in theory, yeah, the local authority could claim ownership of the airspace above it and license it out. But then that's going to open up council to liability, perhaps in respect of nuisance claims and such like. Then you've got issues with accidents, damage to property, damage to people. So, as I say, a lot to think about. Overall, I do think local authorities have a great opportunity to take advantage of the evolving legal position and be better informed. I suppose that may incur additional resourcing and expense, but ensuring up-to-date policies will substantially mitigate the risk of legal challenge, I think.
Right, so you can expect a few calls and emails after this, Yvonne, I would think. We just surveyed our viewers, and all of one of them is certain that their local authority does have a policy in place. It's a mixed audience.
Do. It's just whether they are up to date.
Yeah.
They'll need to be obviously reviewed regularly, and I don't think there's any consistency. That's the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. But the reason I was getting so excited about this idea of a red route was, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but if you could say to Amazon, for your commercial deliveries of parcels to residents in our borough, if you apply to us, we'll give you a license, and we've consulted with all of our residents and we're all on board with this because the money you pay us is going to build a new school. Everybody's happy with that idea. And if you pay us for that, then we guarantee no one else will use that airspace, and you can get your packages through whenever you want. And that struck me as a real simple way for councils to tap into the revenue opportunities here, albeit with some risk.
Yeah, so I definitely think there'll be opportunity, but then against those that want their Amazon packages delivered quickly, you're going to get residents that don't want drones flying by their house or by their windows or breaching their privacy in their garden.
Or other delivery companies who aren't so keen on selling off exclusivity to airspace. We try very hard not to do that. When we give exclusive airspace, we tend to call it military operations. Right. One of the principles in aviation, as a general comment, has been that the airspace is accessible to all.
Well, one thing that obviously as well, we've got to think about how councils can also are using technology. Obviously, I've talked about the role they would have in governance, and that's one thing. But and I think perhaps Steve would talk about how councils are already using them for surveying land or enforcement activities. But one thing you talked about, Andrew, is obviously space. And I'm big cities. Where is the space to drop it? Perhaps there is opportunity for repurposing. Car parks.
Yeah.
Council buildings having charge points on top of buildings like phone masts. Is that
indeed? That's I think a really interesting issue. What you've got to have for that is power that runs all the way to the actual roof, which is a different challenge again, and probably got to have access to the building without having to go through security and be escorted and get a badge and all that sort of stuff as well. So another issue, but we're at that really interesting interface, aren't we, between law and policy? And it's one thing to have laws, and it's one thing to say that these people are in charge of, these people aren't in charge. But there's a third interface, or a triangular interface, between law, policy, and what the technology allows and what the technology is available to do. And if I may just instantly plug CIVATAglobal, that's the very point, I think, of Civata.
Andrew, I was just about to say, it sounds to me like somebody needs to create a global association so that everyone can get together and agree on these policies.
What a brilliant idea.
And practices. So viewers, Andrew's association is exactly that body, and he's going to give us a brief overview now of what it does.
Now, okay. Well, CIVATAglobal tries to bring together both the local government side, the local authority side, to work out some of these issues that Yvonne highlighted so well, and also what the industry's doing and what the industry's capable of doing. I think there's a huge scope for both sides to get together and work together. We need to shape a lot of these rules. We need to shape all the rules are being written as we speak. What Yvonne outlined was established through EASA a couple of years ago. But as the technology evolves, we want to move from things like within line of sight to beyond line of sight. We want to move to flying people around. We're going to need to find ways to bring the local government authorities and the industry together. And that's why I would strongly recommend that anyone join as a member, because clearly it's helpful to be able to join that. And one of the reasons you have a trade association, of course, is to say the things that you can't be seen to be saying, although you think them. So that's a very helpful reason for us. And thank you to Finan for putting the link up on the chat there. We also produce things like guides to some of the issues that you need to think about, and the first edition of that is on our website now and is downloadable. So we're monitoring what's going on. We're trying to do all those sorts of things, plus represent the industry to regulators and to policymakers. That's
fantastic, Andrew. There's some links to some of those papers have gone up on the chat, and I may be overstepping the mark here, but I understand that membership of Civata is at no cost to local authorities. Is that correct?
As we speak, yes, that's correct. I mean, yes, local governments are such an important part of this, and the industry needs to have a much better dialogue with local governments. So for the moment, that's certainly the case. Maybe at some time in the future we need to reassess that. But for the value that we're giving, I think it's an amazing bargain.
Viewers, you've got plenty to win and nothing to lose unless you don't click on that link and join up and find out about liabilities and about policy development and about what other cities are doing and other councils are doing about these issues. Yvonne, thank you very much indeed for that summary. And DJB, the law firm, is also specialising in this area. So if there's legal advice that you want, you can go to them. I'm sure a link will pop up on the chat any moment now. Let's move the conversation on a bit. So one of the aspects that's really driving the use of drones at the moment, and it's been alluded to by both Yvonne and by Andrew, and that's the ability to promote the sustainability agenda, reduce traffic, for example. Paul, at Vectos Transport Consultants, you guys have been looking at this for a while, haven't you? What can you tell us about the sustainability agenda and UAM?
Really nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I work for Vectos in the international team, and I manage a number of international R&D projects, and they really look at the latest innovations in mobility, which include drones, but also electromobility, all types of demand responsive transit. And the real purpose is to promote sustainability amongst the mobility strategies of local authorities. A lot of our clients are developers, and we advise them on sort of new strategic developments and how they can be brought forward in a sustainable way. And yeah, so urban air mobility is becoming one of those components of these strategies that we develop. I'm just going to jump through some of the things that we've been monitoring recently. And this is a really nice example from Reykjavik. It was launched in 2018, and it was the first autonomous drone delivery service at the time. So I don't think they have Amazon in Iceland, good on them, but their Icelandic equivalent, if you're a retailer and you wish to have your packages sent to your customers by drone, you can choose to do so, so long as it's the right dimension and weight. But during this trial, it was done in conjunction with the local authority. So first of all, they had to agree what they had 13 sort of air routes which were cleared, and you can see some of them on the map there took the same route as some of the main roads. So at least that's not going over residential areas. But where the use case here really comes forward is, you see the kind of the routes in the top right there in pink, where the air delivery can be done over water. That's really cutting out many kilometers that have to be done by white van equivalents, either diesel or electric. And we think that's where those cost savings, the real time savings, are going to be gained. The average delivery distance there was about 7 kilometers, so it's not going to be for short trips where you're going to get those gains. It is going to be for slightly longer ones. And they did some evaluation, and they saw that waiting times were cut very significantly, and delivery costs compared to diesel were down to 60% for some of the longer routes. And this service does winch down your items into your back garden if you have one. During the trial, they were also testing having collective pickup points. So maybe at the end of your street, you would have to be directed to pick it up at the right time, and you get an SMS to tell you when it's en route. So you're there to collect it. But this is still ongoing and seems to have been effective. This is just a flag. It's quite an interesting report. It's a couple of years old now, but it was the sort of first attempt in the UK for the government, local authorities, different stakeholders to come together and identify what these viable use cases for drones would be. And as we've mentioned just before, a lot of that tended to move towards things like medical deliveries, but also in Bradford, they saw value in things like fire and rescue and assessing building structure, and you can get there quicker with a drone than you could with like the human equivalent. I mean, that was a couple of years ago, and then fast forward to this year, and brought on by the pandemic, this little drone, it's not a vertical lift, it's like a normal airplane that needs a strip, but it's unmanned, and this was taking medical deliveries from St Mary's Hospital in Southampton over the Solents to the Isle of Wight, significantly cutting journey times, but also you're cutting carbon because it's zero emissions, and no need for vans either side or a diesel ferry. And up in Scotland, again, you can see this sort of use case around islands developing, because this is also performing a role. Skyport's a really big player in the UAM market at the moment. They trialled this year, again, medical supplies being delivered. This is a vertical takeoff. And so this was replacing trips that would be 12 miles by van and then boat, through an air journey. So a 12-mile trip was down to 15 minutes. And you can sort of get a feel about how this specific sector in particular, I mean, it's the first one to be really exploited, sort of delivery of medical supplies, but this particular sector, it could be, moving towards decarbonisation a lot quicker if a lot of these, longer polluting journeys for medical supplies are converted quickly to zero emissions air travel. We mentioned this just before, rather Andrew did. This is the model of a flying taxi in Singapore. This is the trial last year. I believe the trial itself was actually, I don't know if they slightly cheated a bit, but it wasn't fully autonomous. There was a guy in the front with a gear stick, so it wasn't fully autonomous. But the kit was trialed. They're aiming for commercial flights in a couple of years' time, and again, Skyports is involved with that rollout. And this sort of gives you the feeling of, if this is going to be operational, this sort of service in urban areas, then we do need to think about the infrastructure, the access to the landing pads, and the fact that it can't just take off and land opposite a department store where you're going shopping, for example. It will be constrained by where the landing pads are, in the same way that freight would be. But in terms of passenger mobility, the early use cases one might think, again, that would be coming forward first. Okay, we could talk about islands again. If you're making a short hop over the water, it's going to be a lot quicker than hanging around for a waterborne service. But then you can start thinking about rural areas and mountains. We did some research as part of a European proposal recently, and one of the use cases that we came up with was actually mountainous areas, because again, it's about which are the journeys which you can compress quite significantly. Where can you really shave off those journey times? And that could be by taking a mountain out of the equation and not having to go all the way up and down. Also potentially tourism, and again accessing destinations which may not currently have decent access. That might be one of the early use cases, but keep an eye on that. The UK government recently have signalled that they're interested in the potential for delivery companies to use drones in rural parts of the country or isolated towns. Again, I think this is really packaged in their low carbon agenda and net zero carbon targets. So we might see some seed funding coming in for some pilots for these sorts of trials in rural areas. I'm thinking about, you've got the Oxford-Cambridge arc, which has been identified as a really significant potential area for housing growth in the future. That's the sort of kind of place where you might think that where they're planning 10, 20, 30 years hence for these communities to be developed, that's where you might start thinking about integrating the design both on the ground, like having the infrastructure in place for certainly the logistics sides of air drones, but possibly even passenger. And then just the last slides about what we're doing in Vectos. So we do, through our projects, we trial, we research, we test, and we feed this into our transport planning work. So when we speak to planning authorities and developers and architects and urban designers, we do throw sometimes little really visionary, ambitious, maybe a bit pie in the sky ideas at the audience to see what happens, and sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't. But we do believe that urban air mobility is a potentially very strong model for reducing carbon, particularly when you're thinking about new communities. So when we're thinking 10, 20 years hence, we've got to factor in that people's behavior will have changed by then, people's perceptions and values will have changed by then, as they have been through the younger generations currently. In Milton Keynes, they've got these Starship ground drones. There's about 40 of these. I went up to see the trial, and they're doing sort of last mile delivery of grocery shopping and fish and chips, actually, randomly, which must leave the equipment smelling terribly, but it's functioning very well. People have got an app, it comes to the door, you get a notification. So it's reducing the need to travel. And I think any initiative which reduces the need to travel is the best way of meeting these decarbonisation targets. But it also means that if we do have a future where we have landing pads in various areas of new and existing communities, then we need to start moving away from a 2D transport planning perspective and towards a three-dimensional, because if you're thinking about the interface where air mobility is connecting with the land, then we do need to start thinking about what infrastructure needs there will be for these services, where would they be? So that's quite interesting to see how that develops at the moment. Anyway, those are just a few slides. But,
fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. That's really helpful. Panelists, give me a wave if there's anything you want to pick up on that. Yeah, Andrew.
Paul's slides were really fascinating, and thank you for them. I thought one of the really interesting things there was the photos of the routes taken in Reykjavik, and at the moment we're directing things to go along roads and what have you, which is only creating its own congestion at some later point. The breakthrough moment, and perhaps linking back to what Yvonne was saying, the breakthrough moment in this is when a local council can control the airspace above itself in a sort of a dome or a bubble or whatever you want to use, and have what's called UTM, which is UAV traffic management. as opposed to ATM, which is what we do with big aeroplanes up in the sky, in the high sky. And once we do that, we get away from having to be visual line of sight. We also get away from having to follow roads and those sorts of things. There may be good reasons to do that, of course, noise and so forth. But until then, if the council can start to take control of its airspace, its lower airspace, it can start to direct things, and the devices themselves can start to, will separate, will self-separate, which is what all air traffic control tries to do, of course. And so that starts to give the council a lot more control over what they're doing. And I can see an environment where the CAA controls the airspace, but then delegates to each individual council control of its own airspace, which allows us to get into beyond line of sight flying, but also not to have to deliver to a checkpoint or whatever, but actually to places where people are, whilst also having the ability to go in and say, well, as a matter of fact, there's a new crane on the corner of 3rd Street and Main Street, so you can't land there, or there's a football match on Friday nights at the ground, so you can't fly over the football field, or whatever. I mean, and you know, Andrew, that's where we can go.
That's exactly where this gets really exciting. And Steve is itching to get into the conversation, and it's going to give us some use cases any second. But just before we do that, let's wrap up this particular section. Yvonne, when you hear a phrase like when councils take control of their airspace, what goes through your mind?
Yeah, so well, Andrew said basically the point I was trying to make about the governance of local councils, but what I like particularly about Paul's side, seeing the air taxi, you know, everyone likes the idea of flying Uber home, I suppose, but not just manned, unmanned, is the traffic. Obviously, one issue we have is traffic on the streets. We want to get away from that, but I suppose, and Andrew saying we can take control, then does it fall to the local authority to manage the air traffic? Because there's going to be volume of traffic either way you look at it. And so that's one of the risks for local authorities, if they are going to take governance of the airspace, is managing that.
I think
for sure, but of course it is three-dimensional though. So you manage to activate that. Mind you,
I suppose I'm thinking more in the biggest cities and towns.
Yeah. But if you ever look in any if you ever look at any of the sort of promotional stuff people like Uber have made, you know, all these people go into this beautiful life and fly in these things and look down over the ground and there's no traffic on the ground, so it'd be quicker to drive. But, you know, it's always struck me as a design flaw of the Uber stuff. But yeah, clearly that's going to be an issue. I think we're a long way away from having the sort of congestion in the sky that we got on the ground, though.
I think it's more extra resourcing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there is a resource issue, although remarkably a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's not called automated for nothing. You know, we can do a lot of this stuff with systems as opposed to needing to use humans. The big mistake we make in air traffic control is we assume the aeroplanes are dumb and that only the person sitting behind a radar screen, think about that, World War I technology, a radar screen using a VHF radio can control the airplanes. It's bizarre.
But that's a really key point in all of this, isn't it? Quite often we're not talking about facts, we're not talking about what's possible, we're talking about how people feel about it.
Mate, it's the way we've always done it.
Yeah. Paul, a couple of quick questions from the audience. When you were talking about the scheme in Reykjavik, what happens when there's bad weather? I mean, I understand it's snowing.
Reykjavik, bad weather? Never.
Yeah, the percentages show that it doesn't. It's pretty resilient, and I think the trial in the Scottish Highlands and Islands is deliberate, and they're rolling that pilot through this winter in Scotland because they want to test the harshest potential environments, because that will give them the data on how resilient it is. What sort of humoured me about the Reykjavik pilot is that in these sort of early drone trials, it was always pizza delivery that seemed to be the thing that they pushed first. I don't know, you were saying, Andrew, is about how people feel, and having pizzas flown at you apparently is what people want. But if they can deliver pizzas in Reykjavik in the winter and it still turns up warm, then I think, again, that proves everything can be. I think
we've just established all we need to about world culture as well. In Milton Keynes, you get fish and chips, and in Reykjavik, you're getting pizza. So there you go. Steve, right, it's finally time to hear about a local authority in the UK that's actually used drones. Steve, what have you used them for, and what have you found as a result? And tell us all you want to about the 3D planning department that you're setting up in Bristol.
Okay. So firstly, there's no such thing as bad weather. There's only inappropriate clothing. I want to get this big tidy banner out of the way. People will be saying, what's that all about? So to get you to focus on me, that's just a project we're running in Bristol to provide cleaner streets, and it's working really well. So thank you. Yeah, so what have we used it for? Well, we've not used the technology anything like to its existing potential, never mind where we expect the technology will go in future. We've used contractors, as I dare say many local authorities have, to do surveys, condition surveys of buildings, monitoring of traffic flows and the like. That will be a lot easier and more valuable to us once we're able to do the beyond line of sight control, because all of these drones, you save a lot on scaffolding and ladder costs, you know, but the drones are going to be a lot more useful if you can fly them from a central depot to any point in the city from a control room, rather than having to take them out to site in the back of a van and launch them from there. You'll cover a lot more ground a lot quicker if you can fly them to the job. So line of sight, beyond line of sight use is going to be crucial to us. So regulation of our own air space and things like that are absolutely crucial. So Yvonne, you'll be getting a call when we've finished, I expect. Lots of other things are possible and doable and will impact on the city, and much of that, we've got a big Amazon distribution place and lots of distribution stuff in and around Bristol. Bristol is a congested area, so our local hospitals, they've all got helipads. They've all got helipads these days. But drone technology, there was a bit of skepticism in the local healthcare sector when we started asking them, what do you think you'll be using drones for? And there was some skepticism around that, but people are beginning now to realize that actually there's a lot to this, and it is going to happen. But again, it's the beyond line of sight that's going to be the big enabler, we think. Certainly, I think. Air taxis. What's going to happen with air taxis? Huge concerns there among the public around safety, nuisance. And so we're not just planning in 3 dimensions. We're going to have to start planning in 4 dimensions: up, down, left, right, forward, backward, and through time. You know, flying over, catching an air taxi home from the nightclub at 3 o'clock in the morning. Good luck getting that past my bedroom window. So huge issues there. Do we have the skills? Do we have the facilities? In Bristol, we're quite lucky. The part of my portfolio that is relevant to this is commercialisation. One of my predecessors decades ago was sufficiently prescient to buy the local cable network. I don't know whether anybody remembers Rediffusion, but when I was a small boy, it was a wonder to me that there was a selector switch in the windowsill, and you changed the channel on the TV using that. Well, that became a redundant technology. Everybody put aerials on the roof, and a local councillor said, well, what we'll do is we'll buy all that. And we've been expanding and extending that network ever since. And that has actually entered council planning policy now. So if you open the ground for anything, we're probably going to require you to put some trunking in to expand our own network. And why do we do that? Because when the ground is already open, you're talking about £1 a metre to extend the network. If you dig up the street, apart from really annoying all my constituents, you're also talking about £200 a metre to extend that network then. And that network, we've been stuffing fiber optic cable down it as quickly as we can. And we've got networks of, well, I don't know off the top of my head, but we're talking hundreds of kilometers of network available now that we as a local authority own and I want to exploit. And all of the things we're talking about, control, operation, regulation, safety, all of that is going to be dependent on digital. Digital is going to command all of that. And obviously, I want to exploit that as much as I can. I'm looking at time.
How resourced, Steve, are you to exploit that? I mean, what do you need to happen in Bristol for you to feel secure that you're on the right path to making all of that happen?
Well, I don't know whether you've noticed, but we haven't got any money anymore. So one of the things I'm here to do is I'm here to say how important this stuff is to us. In Bristol, we own 40% of the land. The local authority owns 40% of the land mass. So that's a huge opportunity. And we're quite slow at developing policy as well. Our cities are going to change massively. I'm expecting office occupation as a reason. This technology that we're using here today, this has been fantastic over the last 8 or 9 months. I think Zoom has let me down twice in the last 8 months. That's extraordinary. Nobody would have thought that was possible. I've told my colleagues in City Hall that they may never ever see me face to face ever again. They're probably quite grateful for that.
Unless they catch a taxi from a nightclub past your bedroom window.
Yes. What happened to the virtual nightclub? So the planning thing is something that we badly need to get a grip on. Bristol's full of cranes. We got to manage all of this stuff around a constantly changing environment. I don't have many, if any, answers, but I've got lots and lots of questions, and a plug for Civata. I think that's a vital tool for how we actually get all this stuff organized properly so that it's much less of the Wild West that I'm sure Yvonne fears.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. I couldn't have said that better.
I just want to put to everyone on the panel a question. I've noticed e-scooters, electric scooters, appeared about 2, maybe 3 years ago on the streets of London and several other cities in the UK. And we're behind the States, obviously, in this. And the way that they appeared was that a number of operators just placed them in various parts of the city and just sat back and watched to see what would happen. They were available for hire. There was no legislation. There was no policy. People just walked past them, said, oh, that looks interesting, signed up, got on the scooter, and away they were. They may have been on a pavement. They may have been on a road. It was entirely up to them to choose. They didn't have a helmet, or they did. Entirely up to them to choose. 3 or 4 years down the line, we've now got a GLA, Greater London Authority sponsored trial of e-scooters for hire. But it took that 3 or 4 years to go from the kind of anarchy of here's a whole bunch of kit chucked on the streets and here's an official policy that, you know, we're going to trial this out and see how it works in these ways. Is it possible that that could happen with drone traffic, with an Amazon, an Uber, a Google, someone getting hold of a whole bunch of drones and using those commercially in Bristol, Steve?
I hope not. I hope not. And I hope that regulation and insurance moves at sufficient pace to make sure that that doesn't happen. We had bikes appear on the streets of Bristol, and rapidly people stopped calling it transport infrastructure and started calling it litter. And we've got a couple of rivers and a floating harbour in Bristol, and they started appearing in the river and in the docks, and some enterprising individuals put them on the roofs of bus stops. So that was anarchy, and a similar kind. We're doing a West of England's doing a trial for electric scooters at the moment in Bristol. And that's not been too, that seems to be much better than the initial experience with the bikes was. But for drones and the like, that's going to cause great public concern, I can imagine, and great concern to me.
Paul, you've got experience of transport policy evolving over dozens of countries, and you've seen what's happened with e-mobility in the UK. Could you see drone usage growing in that way, in that sort of unplanned, chaotic way?
I'm not sure if they're quite like for like. I mean, I've been in Berlin and Rome, Paris, where one literally trips over scooters and bikes because they really have just been let run wild. I think the UK have done it right, actually, because they had the trial in the Olympic Park with the e-scooters, so it was contained. Yeah. They've done the research and are now happy to do some extended trials in other cities. So for once, they've actually they haven't let the mobility run away before the regulation is in place. I'm not sure if the same can be said about drone deliveries. It would need a large organisation, I think, to put up the cash to start delivering things by drone. But I'm not the legal expert, so I wouldn't want to have the final word on that.
Okay, that's fine. Yvonne, I'm not going to force you to answer that question either because it's so speculative, but pick up on it if you'd like to. And there's also a question from Edward Hardy in the audience about plans that may or may not be in place. Are you aware of any plans to teach law graduates the law of airspace and to train lawyers in what's going on with UAM?
I'm not aware of any specific, but obviously you are taught up-to-date legislation. So obviously as things are evolving, you've got to be kept up to date. It's a relatively new area of law for a lot of people, and absolutely it should, everyone specialises in their own area. Mine is property and now UAM law. So yeah, no reason why we can't add it to any curriculum. It's got to be, as I say, as technology advances, legislation is much slower, but it has to keep up. There has to be regulation. And I think everything we just said about e-scooters, safety concerns of the public, nuisance, established principles of law need to be applied.
Great stuff. Thanks, Yvonne. Andrew, everything we've said today seems to point to the fact that we need an association. We need somewhere that we can gather all of the experience and insight that's growing in different places around the world and start developing some policies, some consistent approaches to all of these aspects. How do you see this picture evolving in the UK over the next sort of 2 to 5 years?
Well, first of all, I completely agree that we need to bring together. I think the interesting thing about CIVATA is that we don't just look at the local governments, we try to bring industry into that as well. And I think where do I see it going in the next few years is there's almost no cap to the technological advances. So what I think we need to do is marshal those advances in ways that are really good for cities and do it in a way where we don't end up with all these, bikes and whatever littering everywhere. I think it's very clear. And can I just make a quick note here? Some of us have studied air law and practiced it for 35 years. So, yeah, it is possible to study air law.
Obviously, we're referring to, I don't know what we're going to call it, sub-air law.
Well, it's all part, it depends, isn't it? It's all part of a seamless weave, I think,
It's all part of a seamless weave. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, that's brilliant stuff, panel. But we've got to come to a close. We've gone past midday, and it's time to let all of our viewers get to their lunch, or more likely to jump onto another Teams or Zoom call. Viewers, before you do that, please join me in thanking our terrific panel for sharing their knowledge and giving us such an exciting vision of a very near future of everything from heart transplants to fish and chips being transported between cities any day soon. Please join me in saying thank you to Andrew Charlton of the Civic Air Transport Association, and thank you Steve Pearce, Councillor Steve Pearce of Bristol City Council, and thank you Paul Curtis from Vectos, and thank you Yvonne Hills from Davitt Jones BouldCllr. And Paul and Yvonne, thank you and your organisations also for sponsoring this event and making this conversation possible. Most of all, viewers, as ever, thank you for tuning in again and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with questions. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. We're going to be back for you on the 15th at 8:30 a.m. with a conversation about healthcare estates and how service transformation is transforming those estates, backed by Morgan Sindall. You can register now via the links that are coming up on the chat, and you'll be able to see the video for this session and that session after it's happened, and all of our other sessions at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. If you'd like to get involved in any of these sessions as a sponsor or as a speaker, and of course you do, please email me, toby@threefox.co.uk. So until the week after next, from our panel, and from Vectos, and from Davitt Jones Bould, and from me, and from everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.